Welcome to an abridged reading of the Tapestried Chamber by Sir Walter Scott. About the end of the American War, when the officers of Lord Cornwallis's army, which surrendered at Yorktown, and others who had been made prisoners during the impolitic and ill-fated controversy, were returning to their home country to relate their adventures and repose themselves after their fatigues, there was amongst them a general officer by the name of Brown. He was an officer of merit, as well as a gentleman of high consideration for family and attainments. Some business had carried General Brown upon a tour through the western counties, when, in the conclusion of a morning stage, he found himself in the vicinity of a small country town which presented a scene of uncommon beauty and of a character particularly English. The little town, with its stately old church, whose tower bore testimony to the devotion of ages long past, lay amid pastures and cornfields. The houses were old but in good repair, and the beautiful little river murmured freely on its way to the left of the town. Upon a gentle eminence nearly a mile to the southward of the town were seen, amongst many venerable oaks and tangled thickets, the turrets of a castle as old as the walls of York or Lancaster. And General Brown, observing the smoke arising merrily from several of the ancient wreathed and carved chimney stalks, the walls of the park ran alongside the highway, and through the different points by which the eye found glimpses into the woodland scenery, it seemed to be well stocked. Other points of view opened in succession, now a full one of the front of the old castle, and now a side glimpse of its particular towers, while the simple and solid strength of other strengths of the building seemed to show that they had been raised more for defense than ostentation. Delighted with the partial glimpses which he obtained of the castle through the woods and the glades, our military traveler was determined to inquire whether it might not deserve a nearer view, and whether it contained family pictures or other objects of curiosity worthy of a stranger's visit. When, leaving the vicinity of the park, he rolled through a clean and well-paved street and stopped at the door of a well-frequented inn. Before ordering horses to proceed his journey, General Brown made inquiries concerning the proprietor of the chateau which had so attracted his admiration, and was equally surprised and pleased to hear in reply a nobleman whom we shall call Lord Woodville. How fortunate! Much of Brown's early recollections, both at school and at college, had been connected with young Woodville, whom, by a few questions, he now ascertained to be the same with the owner of this fair domain. He had been raised to the peerage by the decease of his father a few months before, and as the general learned from the landlord, the term of mourning being ended, was now taking possession of his paternal estate in the joyful season of merry autumn, to enjoy the sports of a country famous for game. This was delightful news to our traveler. Frank Woodville had been Richard Brown's best friend at Eton and his chosen intimate at Christ Church, and the honest soldier's heart warmed to find his early friend in possession of so delightful a residence. Nothing was more natural than that the traveler should suspend a journey which there was nothing to render hurried, to pay a visit to an old friend under such agreeable circumstances. The fresh horses, therefore, had only the brief task of conveying the general's traveling carriage to Woodville Castle. A porter admitted them at the lodge, and at the same time rang a bell to give warning of the approach of the visitors. As General Brown alighted, the young lord came to the gate of the hall, and for an instant gazed as at a stranger upon the countenance of his friend, on which war, with its fatigues and its wounds, had made a great alteration. But the uncertainty lasted no longer than till the visitor had spoken, and the hearty greeting that followed was such as can only be exchanged betwixt those who had passed together the merry days of careless boyhood or early youth. If I could have formed a wish, my dear Brown, said Lord Woodville, it would have been to have you here of all men. Do not think you have been unwatched during the years you have been absent from us. I have traced you through your dangers, your triumphs, your misfortunes, and was delighted to see that whether in victory or defeat, the name of my old friend was always distinguished with applause. The general made a suitable reply and congratulated his friend on his new dignities and the possession of a place in a domain so beautiful. Nay, you have seen nothing of it as yet, said Lord Woodville, and I trust you do not mean to leave us till you are better acquainted with it. It is true, I confess, that this old house, like other places of the kind, does not possess so much accommodation as the extent of the outward walls appears to promise, but we can give you a comfortable old-fashioned room, and I venture to suppose that your campaigns have taught you to be glad of worse quarters. The general shrugged his shoulders and laughed. I presume, he said, the worst apartment in your chateau is considerably superior to the old tobacco cask in which I was fain to take up my night's lodging when I was in the bush, as the Virginians call it, with the light corps. There I lay like Diogenes himself, so delighted with my covering from the elements that I made a vain attempt to have it rolled on to my next quarters. But my commander for the time would give way to no such luxurious provision, and I took farewell of my beloved cask with tears in my eyes. Well, since you do not fear your quarters, said Lord Woodville, you will stay with me a week at least, of guns, dogs, fishing rods, flies, and the means of sport by sea and land. I have enough and to spare. You cannot pitch on an amusement, but we will find the means of pursuing it. The general gladly accepted his friendly host's proposal in all its points. After a morning of manly exercise, the day at Woodville Castle ended, as usual in such mansions. Music, in which the young lord was a proficient, succeeded to the circulation of the bottle. Cards and billiards were in readiness, but the exercise of the morning required early hours, and not long after 11 o'clock they prepared to retire. The young lord himself conducted his friend General Brown to the chamber destined for him, which was comfortable but old-fashioned. The bed was of the massive form used in the end of the 17th century, and the curtains of faded silk heavily trimmed with tarnished gold. But then the sheets and the pillows and the blankets looked delightful to the campaigner when he thought of his mansion the cask. There was an air of gloom in the tapestry hangings, which, with their worn-out graces, curtained the walls of the little chamber, and gently undulated as the autumnal breeze found its way through the ancient lattice window. The toilet, too, with its mirror, turbaned after the manner of the beginning of the century, with a coiffure of murried-colored silk, and its 100 strange-shaped boxes provided for arrangements which had been obsolete for more than 50 years. It had an antique and so far a melancholy aspect. But nothing could blaze more brightly and cheerfully than the 2 large wax candles, or if aught could rival them, it was the flaming, flickering logs in the chimney that sent at once their gleam and their warmth through the snug apartment. This is an old-fashioned sleeping apartment, General, said the young lord, but I hope you find nothing that makes you envy your old tobacco cask. I am not particular respecting my lodgings, replied the general. Yet were I to make my choice, any choice, I would prefer this chamber by many degrees to the cheerful and more modern rooms of your family mansion. I trust no doubt. I have no doubt that you will find yourself as comfortable as I wish you, my dear general, said the young nobleman. And once more bidding his guest good night, he shook him by the hand and withdrew. The general once more looked around him, and internally congratulating himself on his return to peaceful life, the comforts of which were endeared by a recollection of the hardships and dangers he had lately sustained, he undressed himself and prepared for a luxurious night's rest. Here, contrary to the custom of this species of tale, we leave the general in possession of his apartment until the next morning. Breakfast was at an early hour, but without the appearance of General Brown. At length Lord Woodville sent a servant to make inquiry after him. The man brought back information that General Brown had been walking abroad since an early hour of the morning, in defiance of the weather, which was misty and ungenial. The custom of a soldier, perhaps, thought the young nobleman. Many of them acquire a habitual vigilance and cannot sleep after the early hour at which their duty usually commands them to be alert. Yet the explanation which Lord Woodville contemplated did not satisfy his own mind. It was in a fit of silence and abstraction that he waited the return of the general. It took place near an hour after the breakfast bell had rung. He looked fatigued and feverish. His hair, the powdering and the arrangement of which, at this time, was one of the most important occupations of a man's whole day, and marked his fashion as much as in the present time the tying of a cravat, or the want of one. It was disheveled and uncurled and void of powder and dank with dew. His clothes were huddled on with a careless negligence remarkable for a military man whose real or supposed duties were usually held to include some attention to the toilet, and his looks were haggard and ghastly in a particular degree. "Good morning, my dear general," said Lord Woodville. Did you not find your bed so much as to your mind as I hoped, and you seem to expect? How did you rest last night?" "Oh, excellently well, remarkably well, never better in my life," said General Brown rapidly, and yet with an air of embarrassment which was obvious to his friend. He then hastily swallowed a cup of tea, and neglecting or refusing whatever else was offered, seemed to fall into a fit of abstraction. "Will you not take the gun today, General?" said his friend and host, but had to repeat the question twice ere he received an abrupt answer. "No, my lord. I am sorry I cannot have the opportunity of spending another day with your lordship. My post horses are ordered and will be here directly." Lord Woodville immediately replied, "Post horses? My good friend, what can you possibly want with them when you promised to stay with me quietly for at least another week?" "I believe," said the general, obviously much embarrassed, "that I might, in the pleasure of my first meeting with your lordship, have said something about stopping here a few days, but I have since found it altogether impossible." "This is very extraordinary," answered the young nobleman. "You seemed quite disengaged yesterday, and you cannot have had a summons today, for our post has not yet come up from town. Therefore you cannot have received any letters." General Brown, without giving any further explanation, muttered something about indispensable business, and insisted on the absolute necessity of his departure in a manner which silenced all opposition on the part of his host. Lord Woodville, with an air of great solemnity, he addressed him thus: "Richard Brown, my old, very dear friend, let me conjure you to answer me upon the word of a friend and the honor of a soldier. How did you in reality rest during last night?" "Most wretchedly indeed, my lord," said the general, in the same tone of solemnity, "so miserably that I would not run the risk of such a second night, not only for all the lands belonging to this castle, but for all the country which I can see from this elevated point of view." "This is extraordinary," said the young lord, as if speaking to himself. "There must be something in the reports concerning that apartment." Again, turning to the general, he said, For God's sake, my dear friend, be candid with me. Let me know the disagreeable particulars which have befallen you under a roof where, with the consent of the owner, you should have met with nothing save comfort." The general seemed distressed by this appeal, and paused a moment before he replied. "My lord," he said at length, "what happened to me last night is of a nature so peculiar and so unpleasant that I could hardly bring myself to detail it even to your lordship, were it not that, independent of my wish to gratify any request of yours, I think that sincerity on my part may lead to some explanation about a circumstance equally painful and mysterious. To others, the communication I'm about to make might place me in the light of a weak-minded, superstitious fool who suffered his own imagination to delude and bewilder him. But you know me in childhood and youth, and will not suspect me of having adopted in manhood the feelings and frailties from which my early years were free." Here he paused, and his friend replied, "Do not doubt my perfect confidence in the truth of your communication, however strange it may be," replied Lord Woodville. "I know your firmness of disposition too well to suspect you could make the object of imposition, and I am aware that your honor and your friendship will equally deter you from exaggerating whatever you may have witnessed." "Well then," said the general, "I will proceed with my story as well as I can, relying on your candor, yet distinctly feeling that I would rather face a battery than recall to my mind the odious recollections of last night." He paused a second time, and then perceiving that Lord Woodville remained silent and in an attitude of attention, he commenced, though not without obvious reluctance, the history of his night's adventures in the tapestried chamber. "I undressed and went to bed as soon as your lordship left me yesterday evening. The wood in the chimney, which nearly fronted my bed, blazed brightly and freely, and aided by 100 exciting recollections of my childhood and youth, which had been recalled by the unexpected pleasure of meeting your lordship, prevented me from falling immediately asleep. While such pleasing reflections were stealing over my mind and gradually lulling me to slumber, I was gradually aroused by a sound like that of a rustling of a silken gown, and the tapping of a pair of high-heeled shoes, as if a woman were walking in the apartment. And ere I could draw the curtain to see what the matter was, the figure of a little woman passed between the bed and the fire. The back of this form was turned to me, and I could observe from the shoulders and the neck that it was that of an old woman, whose dress was an old-fashioned gown, which I think ladies call a sack. That is a sort of a robe completely loose in the body, but gathered into plaits upon the neck and shoulder, which fall down to the ground and terminate in a species of train. I thought the intrusion singular enough, but never harbored for a moment the idea that what I saw was anything more than the mortal form of some old woman about the establishment, who had a fancy to dress like her grandmother, and who, having perhaps, as your lordship mentioned, that you were rather straitened for rooms, had been dislodged from her chamber for my accommodation, and had forgotten the circumstance, and returned by 12 to her old haunt. Under this persuasion, I moved myself in bed and coughed a little to make the intruder sensible of my being in possession of the premises. She turned slowly around, but gracious heaven, my lord, what a countenance did she display to me! There was no longer any question of what she was, or any thought of her being a living being. Upon a face which wore the fixed features of a corpse were imprinted the traces of the vilest and most hideous passions which had animated her while she lived. The body of some atrocious criminal seemed to have been given up from the grave, and the soul restored from the penal fire, in order to form for a space a union with the ancient accomplice of its guilt. I started up in the bed and sat upright, supporting myself on my palms, and as I gazed at this horrible specter, the hag made, as it seemed, a single swift stride to the bed where I lay, and squatted herself down upon it in precisely the same attitude which I had assumed in the extremity of horror, advancing her diabolical countenance within half a yard of mine, with a grin which seemed to imitate the malice and the derision of an incarnate fiend. Here General Brown stopped and wiped from his brow the cold perspiration with which the recollection of this horrible vision had covered it. "My lord," he said, "I am no coward. I have been in all the mortal dangers incidental to my profession, and I may truly boast that no man ever knew Richard Brown dishonor the sword he wears. But in these horrible circumstances, under the eyes and as it seemed almost in the grasp of an incarnation of an evil spirit, all firmness forsook me, all manhood melted from me like wax in the furnace, and I felt my hair individually bristle. The current of my life blood seemed to flow, and I sank back in a swoon. How long I lay in this condition I cannot pretend to guess. But I was roused by the castle clock striking 1, so loud that it seemed as if it were in the very room. It was some time before I dare open my eyes, lest they should again encounter the horrible specter. When, however, I summoned the courage to look up, she was no longer visible. My idea was to pull my bell, wake the servants, and remove to a garret or hay loft to be insured against a second visitation. Nay, I will confess the truth that my resolution was altered by the shame of exposing myself, but by the fear that, if the bell cord hung by the chimney, I might, in making my way to it, be again crossed by the fiendish hag, who, I figured to myself, might still be lurking about some corner of the apartment. I will not pretend to describe what hot and cold fever fits tormented me for the rest of the night, through broken sleep and weary vigils. The day at last appeared, and I rose from my bed ill in health and humiliated in mind. I was ashamed of myself as a man and a soldier. So, huddling on my clothes with the most careless haste, I made my escape from your lordship's mansion, to seek in the open air some relief to my nervous system, shaken as it was by this horrible rencounter with a visitant, for such as I must believe her, from the other world. Your lordship has now heard the cause of my discomposure and of my sudden desire to leave your hospitable castle. In other places, I trust, we may often meet, but God protect me from ever spending a second night under that roof." Strange as the general's tale was, he spoke with such a deep air of conviction that it cut short all the usual commentaries which are made on such stories. Lord Woodville never once asked him if he was sure he did not dream of the apparition, or suggested any possibilities by which it was fashionable to explain supernatural experiences as the wide vagaries of fancy, or deceptions of the optic nerves. On the contrary, he seemed deeply impressed with the truth and the reality of what he'd heard, and after a considerable pause regretted with much appearance of sincerity that his early friend should in his house have suffered so severely. "I am most sorry for your pains, my dear Brown," he continued, "that it is the unhappy and most unexpected result of an experiment of my own. You must know that for my father and grandfather's time at least, the apartment which was assigned to you last night had been shut on the account of reports that it was disturbed by supernatural sights and noises. When I came in possession of the estate, I thought the accommodation which the castle afforded for my friends was not extensive enough to permit the inhabitants of the invisible world to retain possession of a comfortable sleeping apartment. I therefore caused the tapestried chambers, as we call it, to be opened. Yet as the opinion that the room was haunted very strongly prevailed among the domestics and was also known to the neighborhood and many of my friends, I feared some prejudice might be entertained by the first occupant of the tapestried chamber, which might tend to revive the evil report which it labored under, and so disappoint my purpose of rendering it a useful part of the house. I must confess, my dear Brown, that your arrival yesterday, agreeable to me for 1,000 reasons besides, seemed the most favorable opportunity for removing the unpleasant rumors which attached to the room, since your courage was indubitable, and your mind free from any preoccupation on the subject. I could not, therefore, have chosen a more fitting subject for my experiment. Upon my life, said General Brown somewhat hastily, I am infinitely obliged to your lordship. Very particularly indebted indeed. I am likely to remember for some time the consequence of the experiment, as your lordship is pleased to call it. Nay, now you are unjust, my dear friend, said Lord Woodville. You have only to reflect for a single moment in order to be convinced that I could not augur the possibility of the pain to which you have been so unpleasantly or unhappily exposed. I was yesterday morning a complete skeptic on the subject of supernatural appearances. Nay, I am sure that had I told you what was said about the room, those very reports would have induced you by your own choice to select it for your accommodation. It was my misfortune, perhaps my error, but really it cannot be termed my fault that you've been afflicted so strangely. Strangely indeed, said the general, resuming his good temper. And I acknowledge that I have no right to be offended with your lordship for treating me like what I was used to think myself, a man of some firmness and courage. But I see my post horses are arriving, and I must not detain your lordship from your amusement. Nay, my old friend, said Lord Woodville, since you cannot stay with us another day, which indeed I can no longer argue, give me at least half an hour more. You used to love pictures, and I have a gallery of portraits, some of them by Van Dyck, representing ancestry to whom this property and castle formerly belonged. General Brown accepted the invitation, though somewhat unwillingly. It was evident he was not to breathe freely, or at least at ease, until he left Woodville Castle far behind him. He could not refuse his friend's invitation, however, and less so that he was a little ashamed of the peevishness which he had displayed towards his well-meaning entertainer. The general therefore followed Lord Woodville through several rooms into a long gallery hung with pictures, which the latter pointed out to his guests, telling the names and giving some account of the personages whose portraits presented themselves in progression. General Brown was but little interested in the details with which the accounts were conveyed to him. They were indeed of the kind which are usually found in an old family gallery. While Lord Woodville was cramming these words into his guests' ears, against the stomach of his sense, they gained the middle of the gallery, when he beheld General Brown suddenly start and assume an attitude of utmost surprise, not unmixed with fear, as his eyes were suddenly caught and riveted by the portrait of an old lady in a sack gown, the fashionable dress at the end of the 17th century. "There she is," he exclaimed. "There she is, in form and features, though inferior in demoniac expression to the accursed hag who visited me last night." "Well, if that be the case," said the young nobleman, "there can no longer remain any doubt of the horrible reality of your apparition. That is the picture of a wretched ancestress of mine, of whom crimes, a black and fearful catalogue, is recorded in a family history in my charter chest. The recital of them would be too horrible. It is enough to say that in yonder fatal apartment unnatural murder was committed. I will restore it to the solitude to which the better judgment of those who preceded me had consigned it. Never shall anyone, so long as I can prevent it, be exposed to a repetition of the supernatural horrors which could shake such courage as yours." Thus the friends, who had met with such glee, parted in a very different mood. Lord Woodville to command the tapestried chamber to be unmantled and the door built up, and General Brown to seek in some less beautiful country and with some less dignified friend forgetfulness of the painful night which he had passed in Woodville Castle. Thank you for joining me in this reading of the Tapestried Chamber. Have a great day.